Every year on the 4th of July, a nation reads aloud from a single sheet of parchment. It celebrates the words it kept. It says almost nothing about the words it cut. Because the Declaration of Independence had another passage, a long, furious paragraph about human bondage, written in Thomas Jefferson's own hand. It called the Atlantic slave trade a cruel war against human nature itself. And before any man signed his name, the Continental Congress struck it out. This is the story of the line they erased, and of why the truth of that erasure is far worse than the legend we tell in its place. The line Congress cut from the Declaration. We all know the sentence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is the closest thing the United States has to Scripture. But those words were only the beginning of a much longer document, a list of grievances, charge after charge, laid against King George III. And the longest, angriest charge on Jefferson's list was not about taxes, or troops, or trade. It was about slavery. To understand how it got there and how it vanished, you have to go into a hot brick room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. On the 11th of June, the Second Continental Congress named a committee of 5 men to draft a Declaration of Independence: Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The actual writing fell to the youngest of them, a red-haired Virginian of 33, quiet in debate but formidable with a pen. Years later, Adams explained why he had pushed the task onto Jefferson rather than take it himself.
Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. John Adams, recalling the moment long afterward.
So Jefferson wrote. In the space of about 2 weeks, working alone at a rented desk, he produced the rough draught, and into it he poured a grievance about the slave trade that was longer than anything else in the document. On the 28th of June, the committee laid that draft before Congress with the slavery passage fully intact. For a few days, the birth certificate of the United States carried an open indictment of human bondage. Here is what it said. Jefferson blamed the whole institution on one man, the king, and he reached for the loftiest language of natural rights he could find. Read it slowly. It is genuinely startling to hear, coming from the founding generation.
He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. Thomas Jefferson, in the original rough draught of the Declaration, June 1776.
Strip away the 18th century grammar, and the accusation is plain. The king has attacked humanity itself by seizing innocent people, enslaving them, and shipping them across an ocean to bondage or death. It is piracy, shameful, Jefferson says, even by the standards of powers he calls infidel. And it is being run by a Christian monarch who ought to know better. A market where men should be bought and sold. In 1776, No state paper anywhere in the world spoke of the slave trade in language quite like this. And that is exactly why the passage is so dangerous to misunderstand. Because the story almost everyone reaches for, that America nearly abolished slavery at its birth and lost its nerve, is false. The deleted passage was not an abolitionist manifesto. Look at what it actually attacks: the slave trade, the buying and the shipping, not slavery itself. It proposed to free no one. Not a single enslaved person in Virginia or Carolina would have walked free if this clause had survived. It condemned the commerce while leaving the institution, and the people held inside it exactly where they were. And look at who it blames. Every verb points at the king. He waged. He prostituted his veto. He kept the market open. In Jefferson's telling, the slave trade is something Britain did to the colonies, as if Virginia planters and Rhode Island shippers were its victims rather than its customers. It is one of the most audacious acts of blame shifting in the founding record, a nation of slaveholders declaring itself the innocent party. Not everyone was fooled. Across the ocean, the English writer Samuel Johnson had already aimed a single devastating question at the American cause.
How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Samuel Johnson, in London, 1775.
The loudest yelps for liberty. Johnson was talking about men exactly like the one holding the pen. Because here is the fact that anchors this entire story. Thomas Jefferson enslaved people. Across his life, more than 610 of them, some 400 at Monticello at a time. He freed only a handful and sold hundreds to pay his debts. The man who wrote that all men are created equal and who wrote that the slave trade was a war against human nature spent his life as one of the largest enslavers in Virginia. This was not a lapse. His anti-slavery language had always been carefully bounded, as he had shown 2 years earlier in a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America.
The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Thomas Jefferson, in A Summary View of the Rights of British America, 1774.
First, stop the imports. Freedom for the people already enslaved. That could wait indefinitely. That was the shape of Jefferson's anti-slavery. End the trade, protect the property. But the deleted passage does something stranger still in its final lines. Something that only makes sense if you know where Virginia's planters were looking in the winter of 1775. They were looking at the sea, and at a British warship, and at the man aboard it, John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia. On the 7th of November, 1775, from the deck of that ship, Dunmore issued a proclamation.
I do hereby declare all indentured servants, Negroes or others, appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops. Lord Dunmore, Royal Governor of Virginia, in his proclamation, the 7th of November, 1775.
Freedom to any enslaved person who fled a rebel master and took up arms for the crown. It was a war measure meant to terrify planters more than to liberate anyone. Dunmore himself enslaved people and freed none of them, but its effect was seismic. Hundreds ran for the British lines. They formed what was called the Ethiopian Regiment, some of them going into battle with sashes that read "Liberty to Slaves." Across the whole war, an estimated 20,000 enslaved people would escape to the British. They had names. Harry Washington, who fled the estate of George Washington himself and would end his life a free man in Sierra Leone. Titus of New Jersey, who returned as Colonel Ty one of the most feared guerrilla fighters of the war. To Virginia's gentry, this was the nightmare made real, and George Washington called Dunmore a monster, an arch traitor to the rights of humanity. Now go back to Jefferson's paragraph, to the part one did not read you before. After all that soaring language about the sacred rights of a distant people, the passage turns. Jefferson accuses the king of one final crime, that he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase their liberty by murdering the people upon whom he had forced them. Read that again. The same paragraph that mourns the enslaved for having their liberty stolen condemns them in its last breath for trying to seize it back. That is Dunmore. Jefferson is answering Dunmore. He takes Britain's offer of freedom to the enslaved and recasts it as the ultimate royal outrage. The moral horror at the top of the passage and the naked fear of black freedom at the bottom live in the very same sentence. And when Congress cut the rest away, that fear is the one piece it kept, compressed into 4 words that survive in the Declaration to this day. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. So if the clause freed no one and blamed the king and feared the enslaved, why did Congress bother to remove it at all? The answer is that naming the trade, even to condemn a king for it, was more than the Union could bear, because 13 colonies were about to become one country, and that country was soaked in slavery from Georgia to Massachusetts. Jefferson kept his own record of who objected, and his finger points first at the Deep South. South Carolina and Georgia, he wrote, wanted the trade to continue and had never tried to restrain it. Charleston was the great slave port of the continent. Once the trade reopened after the war, tens of thousands more Africans would pass through it. But the guilt did not stop in the South. The northern colonies, Jefferson noted, felt a little tender under those censures too, for though they held few slaves themselves, they had been the carriers. Rhode Island shipping families out of Newport and Bristol dominated the American slave trade. One Bristol dynasty alone, the DeWolfs, is remembered as the largest slave trading family in the nation's history. The trade was not a Southern sin. It was a national business. And every one of these colonies had, just 2 years before, signed a pledge to end it. In 1774, the Continental Association had bound them to wholly discontinue the slave trade, to neither import nor purchase a single enslaved person after that December. It sounded like conscience. It was leverage. One more way to punish British commerce. And the moment independence made that leverage useless, the pledge was quietly abandoned. What looked in 1774 like a moral stand had always been a tactic, and 1776 simply revealed it. The deletion itself happened behind closed doors. From the 1st of July to the 4th, Congress debated the Declaration line by line, in strict secrecy, sworn to reveal nothing. No transcript was kept. No minutes of the argument survive. We do not have a single delegate's account of the exact words spoken when the slavery passage was struck. We have only one witness, and he is the last man you would call neutral. Jefferson himself, who sat there watching his paragraph die and wrote down why.
The clause 2, reprobating the enslaving the inhabitants of Africa, was struck out in complaisance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves, and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue it. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under those censures, for though their people have very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. Thomas Jefferson, from his Notes of the Proceedings, 1776.
We should be honest about this source, because the whole story leans on it. This is Jefferson's account, and no other delegate confirms it. He recorded it in the moment in 1776 and reproduced it word for word in his autobiography 45 years later, so it is not merely an old man's foggy memory. But notice what it does. It places the blame on the far south and on the northern shippers, and leaves the pen, his pen, clean. It is testimony, not a court record. The safest thing we can say is not that we know precisely what happened in that room, but that we know the passage went in whole and came out gone, and that the man who wrote it told us the reason was to keep the Union together. Which raises the real puzzle of the Declaration. Congress cut the passage about slavery, but it kept the sentence about equality. Why was one too dangerous to sign and the other perfectly safe? Because they did different work. The promise, all men are created equal, was an abstract philosophy aimed at a candid world and at the foreign powers whose help the new nation needed. Benjamin Franklin even sharpened it, changing Jefferson's sacred and undeniable to the harder, cleaner self-evident. It justified breaking with a king. It committed no one who signed it to free anyone. But the slavery clause was an accusation with a subject and a verb, and every man in that room who profited from human bondage stood accused by it. They could all agree to the promise precisely because the promise, as written, asked nothing of them. And there the story might have ended, a grievance deleted, a contradiction buried, a promise carefully drained of consequence. Except that words, once written, do not always stay where their authors leave them. The founders had let one radical sentence survive because they believed it was safe. They were wrong. Within 2 generations, the people the Declaration had never meant to include picked up its own language and turned it into a weapon.
See your Declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language? Hear it, proclaimed to the world July the 4th, 1776, that all men are created equal. Compare your own language with your cruelties inflicted upon us. David Walker, in his appeal, Boston, 1829.
David Walker, the free son of an enslaved father, flung the sentence back in the nation's face and named Jefferson directly. 19 years later, at Seneca Falls, a convention of women rewrote the promise to include themselves, adding 2 words the founders never wrote.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls, July 1848.
And in 1852, in Rochester, New York, a man who had been born enslaved stood before a 4th of July audience and made the gap between the promise and the practice into the greatest abolitionist speech in American history. Frederick Douglass did not reject the Declaration. He held it up, and then he held up the mirror beside it.
What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. I am Frederick Douglass, Rochester, the 5th of July, 1852.
And then came the man who would stake a war on that one sentence. Abraham Lincoln built his case against slavery on the proposition that all men are created equal, at Peoria and finally at Gettysburg, where he dated the nation's birth not to the Constitution but to 1776, to a country conceived in liberty and dedicated to that proposition. The words that freed no one in the summer of 1776 helped justify a war that would free 4 million. It took black writers and women's conventions and some 620,000 dead and 3 amendments to the Constitution to drag the promise even partway toward its meaning. So what, in the end, did America actually do in July of 1776? It did not forget the contradiction at its heart. It edited around it. It kept the soaring promise and struck out the awkward accusation. It let the words, all men are created equal, stand as an idea, and refused to let the words about slavery stand as a charge. The deleted clause was never the road not taken toward freedom. It was the revolution's contradiction captured in a single paragraph, a document that could speak the language of universal liberty precisely because it never intended that liberty for the people it was describing. The passage still exists. You can see it in Jefferson's rough draught. The lines scored through, the words the founders decided a new nation could not afford to say out loud. They kept the promise and deleted the accusation, and left the promise for others later to try to collect. That the words were finally used against the very order that wrote them is the closest thing this story has to hope. But it is worth remembering, every 4th of July, that the promise was never freely given. It had to be taken from a document that meant to keep it just out of reach. From ember and ash, this was the line Congress cut from the Declaration.